We're joined on the line by Dr. Einat Wilf and Adi Schwartz. They are the authors of a new book, The War of Return, How Western Indulgence of the Palestinian Dream Has Obstructed the Path to Peace. Dr. Wilf and Adi, thanks so much for joining the show. Let's talk for a second about the situation in Israel. There's a lot of controversy right now, obviously, surrounding COVID, but there's very little controversy surrounding sort of the Israeli treatment of the Palestinian Authority. And that's because everybody, right, left, and center, sort of understands that there's just an insane level of intransigence in the Palestinian Authority. But that's something the West doesn't seem to understand. The West seems to continue to promote the idea, at least many in Europe, not the Trump administration, but the Europeans, continue to promote the idea that if Israel just made territorial concessions to the Palestinians, that this would solve the problem. Dr. Wilf, why is that wrong?
Because we have tried it several times only to realize that again and again, more than the Palestinians want a state for themselves in part of the land, they still insist that the Jewish people, as a people and a nation, will not have their own state in the other part of the land, in any borders whatsoever. And this has been a repeated choice. And this is indeed something that most Israelis have understood, which is why most Israelis now are clustered around the political center, in which they are willing to make compromises for peace, but they unfortunately have come to the realization that at this point in history, the Palestinians are still waging a battle, as they say in all their demonstrations, to control the land from the river to the sea. So all of it with no willingness to share and divide the land with the Jewish people.
So, Adi, one of the things that folks on the left, particularly in Europe, like to say, but also in the United States, increasingly in the Democratic Party, is that there is this Palestinian right to return that needs to be enacted. And this is really what the book is about, this idea that Palestinians are claiming that they should be able to essentially flood into Israel by the millions, thereby essentially destroying the Jewish character of the state of Israel. Why is the right of return a myth? Why is it wrong? Why isn't it correct?
So the bottom line is that Palestinians do not have a legal right to enter Israel. No country, there is no precedent for a country that was forced to accept any other people against its will, and certainly not as a legal right. So Palestinians mention all kinds of legal and other arguments, but they don't hold. There's simply no precedent for that. Israel is a sovereign state, and it can decide, like any other country on earth, who is going to enter the country and who isn't. And one very important thing is that while Palestinians are trying to portray this issue as legal and the humanitarian issue, it is not. It is a political issue. And as Einat just said, it disguises actually their wish to turn Israel into another Arab state. So Palestinians are repeatedly saying that they have a right of return, but just by saying that again and again and again, it doesn't make it any true. So if you look into it in legal terms, they do not have a legal right to enter Israel.
So, Dr. Wilf, it seems like a lot of people refuse to understand this, refuse to acknowledge that the Palestinian leadership particularly has been indoctrinating the Palestinian population for literally decades in the idea that Israel is going to disappear. One thing that you've seen in the United States is people like Peter Beinart, who's just been awful for years, but Peter Beinart recently came out and endorsed the idea of a universal state, essentially a state of, quote unquote, all of its people, in which the Jews and the Palestinians live side by side under one government elected by everybody. Why is that such a pipe dream?
Because it exists nowhere in the world, except maybe in America. And I think even in America, it's mostly a vision rather than a reality. Throughout the world is comprised of nation states, where each state has a dominant ethnic, religious, national group and some national ethnic minorities. So in the region between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea, there are only two stark options. A state is there's either going to be two states with one of them being Jewish, or there's going to be one state that is entirely Arab, and the Jews are a minority in an Arab state. It's either Jewish or Arab. There are no universal kumbaya choices. They just do not exist. It seems harsh and stark, especially to Americans who do not generally understand what it means to be a nation state, despite the fact that this is what most states in the world are. But this is the choice, which is why, by the way, Peter's ideas got zero resonance in Israel because they're not relevant to Israel. They're only relevant to how some Jews in America want to portray themselves, but they're utterly irrelevant to how Israelis view their future.
And Dr. Wilf, one of the most insane things about this is that as the anti-Semitism from the Palestinians increases, as the anti-Semitism from Iran increases, as more and more you see overt statements of anti-Semitism in Europe and indeed in the United States, there's this concomitant rise in the number of people who are suggesting that Israel should basically give up the ghost and stop existing. So even as the reason for Israel's existence becomes more and more obvious to everyone, including Israelis, the number of people who are saying Israel should basically just evacuate itself, that Israel should stop being a Jewish state, that's on the increase. Why are those two things happening simultaneously? It's clearer and clearer why Israel exists, and yet there are more and more people saying Israel shouldn't exist.
And one of the things I love to say is, sure, a John Lennon world is a beautiful idea, no borders, no religions, all of humanity living as one. It's just that when you ask the Jewish people to take the first step, I get very suspicious. Somehow it's only the state of Israel that stands in the way of this global utopia. No, Israel is normal. And by the way, Israel doesn't exist only because and for anti-Semitism. It exists to express the Jewish people's right to self-determination. What we have today is that anti-Zionism has become the new, shiny, respectable mask behind which the same ancient hatred hides. Anti-Semitism has become unrespectable, certainly in academic circles. It's considered the ideology of poor people, a certain kind of marginalized group. But anti-Zionism has this kind of sense of it's respectable among academics, among various groups, so they can hide behind anti-Zionism to basically project the same old hatred.
Well, Dr. Einat Wilf and Adi Schwartz, the new book is The War of Return, How Western Indulgence of the Palestinian Dream Has Obstructed the Path to Peace. It is totally worth the read. Go pick up a copy right now. Thank you both for your time.
Thank you very much.